So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in Cuts International's GSA series, Global Strategies in the Age of Geoeconomics. Thank you for joining us today, whether you are tuning in from Jaipur, Accra, Santiago, Moscow, or anywhere in between. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll be taking a tour of the world's major geoeconomic fault lines, from the Indo-Pacific to Africa, Latin America, Eurasia, and the US-China tech rivalry, with five speakers who bring real on-the-ground expertise to each of these regions. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping notes. Please keep your mics and videos muted through the session unless you are called upon to speak. If you are joining from a shared or public space, kindly keep your phones on silent. We'll have a dedicated question and answer segment later. So please drop your questions in the chat box as we go along and we'll pick them up at the right time. The session is being recorded and recording will be uploaded on the Cuts International's YouTube channel. With that, I'm delighted to invite Divya Murli of IASS Singapore, University of Singapore to set the stage for today's discussion. Over to you, Divya.
Thank you, Dhruv. Greetings, everyone, and a warm welcome to the third installment of the webinar on Global Strategies in Age of Geoeconomics, GSAGE, an initiative by the CUTS International. My name is Divya Murali. I'm a research associate at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and it is my absolute privilege to moderate today's session. We are meeting at a critical juncture in global affairs, where the traditional boundaries between economics and national security have effectively dissolved. Today, elements that were strictly considered elements of economics, be it trade, tech, critical mineral supply chains, are no longer just drivers of market growth, but they are being used as levers of statecraft. This fusion of economics and strategy defines this era of geoeconomics. Today's webinar of the GSAGE series is dedicated to breaking down these complex dynamics through granular regional realities. We have 5 presentations today by 5 distinguished experts that dive into the regional responses to this great power competition. These will eventually be brought out as papers of a major compendium and will culminate into an international conference sometime later in 2026 in India. The 5 speakers will each have about 10 minutes to present their studies, post which we'll have a 20-25-minute session of Q&A with the audience. I kindly request all the speakers to stick to the time. Without further ado, let me invite the first speaker, Mr. Jorge Jaime, former ambassador of Chile to China and the United States. He is also Honorary Professor, Institute of International Studies, University of Chile, and a non-resident fellow, Quincy Institute, Washington, D.C. He will present on the topic Geoeconomics and Active Non-Alignment in South America, which he jointly worked with Mr. Ignacio Araya, Chilean political scientist and consultant. Ambassador Jaime, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. A small correction. I've been ambassador to China, to India, and to South Africa, but not to the United States. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this very exciting webinar. I'm really honored by the invitation of CUTS International to speak at it, and very much look forward to further developments in this very exciting project. So, what is my paper about? What I start is with a report that was delivered in 2023 by the Group of 30. And the question it asks is, why does Latin America underperform? And this is a long-standing question that has been examined by specialists. Latin America is a region that is very rich in natural resources. It is basically underpopulated. It has much going for it. Yet it has been plagued by economic stagnation. In the most recent case from 2013 to 2023, it was called another lost decade, with a growth of 0.9% yearly average, which is even worse than the famously lost decade of the 1980s, where annual growth was 2%. So the question is, why do we have this situation? Given time constraints, I will necessarily be telegraphic in my remarks. One answer that came out, in the 60s and 70s was dependency theory, and it is that the region suffered from being, oppressed, exploited by an international system that basically extracted resources from the region and left it in poverty and in underdevelopment. Dependency theory pointed rightly out to a number of elements in international trade and international financial flows that put the region at disadvantage, but failed to come up with a prognosis on the way forward. How do you get out of that? It also failed to account for the fact that countries in Asia, and particularly in East Asia, Southeast Asia, famously like the four Asian tigers, managed to get out of underdevelopment. They did very well, despite being in an underdeveloped condition in the 50s and 60s. So, in the course of the few decades, we have had a number of responses to this situation. In the 1990s, we had something called the Washington Consensus that basically posited that market forces, if left free to reign, would bring about progress and development. And for a while in that decade, everybody, the governments of the right, left, and center, applied the Washington Consensus, which implied to privatize, open up, and reform Latin American economies towards a more open market system. In some cases, even the post office was privatized, yet it didn't have much of an effect. Then, in the first decade of the new century, you had a wave of progressive governments coming into play in Brazil, in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay. And they brought about some progress in terms of social policies and some amount of income redistribution, but it really didn't alter the basic structure of the Latin American economies, which are based on the production of primary products, the export of minerals and agricultural goods, without much value added and without changing much the region's insertion into global value chains. So that is how we get to the current situation, in which we find ourselves in a transition from has been called the third phase of globalization that started in 1980, roughly, till the present time, to a transition towards what has been called, that's the title of this series, Geoeconomics, in which the basic rules of international economic engagement based on sort of commercial criteria have been changed towards much more geopolitical concerns, in which the nation state has recovered the role it lost for much of the period between 1980 and say 2010, 2015 or so. So we have moved from an era in which basically business and transnational corporations dictated the rules to an age in which the role of the nation state and in which geopolitical interests are holding sway. Now, it is in this context that we see the competition between the United States and China as the key driver of international politics. There is much going on in the world today. The term that has been used is polycrisis, in which we have pandemics, we have wars, we have mass migrations, we have climate change, we have many sort of nasty things that they all bounce off each other, making things even worse, leading to a vicious cycle. But at the core of all this, I would posit to you, is the competition for primacy between these two superpowers, between the United States and China. Now, it is in that context that we have to look at what has been happening in the region in the course of the past couple of years with the start of the second term of Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump has posited something that has been dubbed the Monroe Doctrine, which is a revival of the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, in which the United States asserted its dominance over the Western Hemisphere. This has been now revived with an added twist, with the United States insisting that it has some sort of primary right over strategic minerals and over key infrastructure projects in the Western Hemisphere. And the basic notion of the Monroe Doctrine is to exclude what it calls extra-hemispheric powers from the Western Hemisphere. This is code for China, but it also could apply to other powers like India, like European powers, and so on. Basically, the notion being that the United States is reasserting its sway over what has traditionally been referred to as the U.S. backyard, meaning Latin America. Very well. Now, it is in that context that with my colleagues, Carlos Fortin and Carlos Rominami, we have coined the term active non-alignment as a response to these very critical challenges. And this has been shown in a number of publications, including this latest expression of the book called The Non-Aligned World, Striking Out in an Era of Great Power Competition, which was published last year by Polity Press, in which we set forth the argument that taking a page from the non-aligned movement of yesteryear, in which, of course, India played such a significant role, but adapting it to the realities of the 21st century, in which the Global South has emerged with such force. About half of all global trade now is South-South trade, which is very different from the situation in the 70s and 80s, when it was about 20% of total trade. Some similar can be said about FDI. So it's a new reality, the reality, of course, of the BRICS, of rising powers, of emerging economies. And it is in this context that we argue that active non-alignment provides a response. This arose originally in the context of Latin America in 2020, when Latin America was hit by a triple whammy, the pandemic, which led to 28% of the world's deaths in Latin America, although it only has 8% of the world's population, which led to the biggest downturn in the regional economy, 6.6% in 2020, and severe pressures from the Trump administration to cancel various infrastructure projects, which made things, needless to say, even worse. So, in response to that crisis, the very severe crisis in 2019, 2020, we came up with this notion, active non-alignment, as a response to that very critical situation. And we have continued to elaborate on it, and we have found that this is not only valid for Latin America, it also caught on in the rest of the world. President of South Africa, Mr. Ramaphosa, has referred to active non-alignment as South Africa's foreign policy. The Prime Minister of Malaysia has done so, and other leaders also expressed their interest in the term. In the case of Latin America, this has been particularly so in the case of Brazil, which is in some ways the foremost example of applying active non-alignment. So what does active non-alignment stand for? It puts the country's national interest front and center. it refuses to take sides in this competition between Washington and Beijing. The grand strategy, if you will, of active non-alignment is what we call playing the field. That is, you look out for opportunities.
You have 2 more minutes to wrap it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That are out there because this competition between China and the United States opens possibilities. You can play one side against the other. And the tactic of active non-alignment is what we call hedging. That is, you cover your back, you make perhaps take one step forward, 2 steps backwards to deal in a situation with a situation of high uncertainty. One thing you do not want to do is put all your eggs in one basket. President Lula, who has been dealing with very serious challenges from Mr. Trump in a country that also has very strong links with China, $180 billion worth of bilateral trade between China and Brazil last year, is in many ways the foremost example of active non-alignment in practice. So, summing up, what we are saying is that for Latin America, but also for African and Asian countries, for the global South, in other words, that has emerged with such force in the past few years as a force to be reckoned with in world affairs. Foreign Policy magazine called 2023 the year of the global South, and there is a reason for that. And in many ways, the natural foreign policy of the global South is active non-alignment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hai, for this very comprehensive presentation and for highlighting active non-alignment as not just passivity, but as a pragmatic sovereign tool to protect regional autonomy while managing deep commodity dependence. Now, moving from South America to the vital maritime and land corridors, I invite our second speaker, a set of speakers for the day, Ms. Priyam Gandhi Modi, Executive Director of FEC Council, Ms. Tejaswini Shankar and Ms. Aniruddha and Mr. Aniruddha Venugopal to present their work on the topic Beyond the Suez Route, IMEC, BRI, and the Geoeconomics of Indo-Pacific Connectivity. I shall now hand it over to Priyam and team. The floor is yours for the next 10 minutes. Please unmute. Please unmute. Yeah, you can speak.
Greetings. Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to present our work, and picking up from Ambassador Hai's comments on non-alignment. Non-alignment in practice really is the realization of some of these key ambitious geoeconomic corridors. When we discuss IMEC, of course, when the Memorandum of Understanding was signed, it was in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, and the political situation was vastly different from the current geopolitical realities in West Asia. But having said that, despite the very rapidly changing geopolitical realities, IMEC still remains very much on the agenda of the leadership of countries, all of the signatory countries, be it in Europe, be it the United States, be it in West Asia, be it India. Having said that, I will now hand over to Ms. Tejaswini and Anirudh to present our work, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Kutz, for having us. I think in the context and backdrop of a Donroe doctrine that Ambassador has just mentioned, it's important that we address diversification and sort of decentralization. So let me start with the question that our paper is really trying to answer, which is if a plurilateral corridor can outcompete a decade of centralized diplomacy, specifically centralized infrastructure diplomacy. So that's what we will be addressing over the course of our 10 minutes, using the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC, as the test case, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a China initiative, as the comparison point. So I will just go through the history very quickly because I will assume that the room here already knows the broad strokes. So from the 9th to the 13th century, the Indian Chola naval power and Arab monsoon trade built something that was very genuinely decentralized, a multi-hub Indian Ocean economy where no single power held all the leverage. So, but this sort of changed the moment that the European powers arrived. Goa, Hormuz, Malacca, these choke points were locked down one by one. And eventually, when the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, it of course cut transit time in half, but it also created a single point of failure that we are still dealing with today. So after the Indian independence, India spent the Cold War building around exactly that vulnerability, that choke point. Kandala port to bypass Pakistan, the 1971 war proving just how decisive choke point control can be, and that I think extends into current geopolitics and scenarios as well. But by the 2000s, China's anxiety about the same problem, what they called the Malacca dilemma, produced what was the Gwadar Master Plan, while India's answer was Act East and Andaman hubs. So the entire region and the entire world, all of the states, all of the powers were looking at the same issues, the same choke points, and the same vulnerabilities. So this is what became very clear, was that whoever controls the choke point always sets the terms of trade. Now we've seen that with the Strait of Hormuz in the last 1 year, and how much that has affected not just the regional parties but trade across, and prices and the standard of living across the globe. So IMEC is India's attempt, alongside, of course, with its partners, to build something where there is no single choke point and there is no single master that is controlling the entire thing. So why is this gaining a lot of attention now, rather than 5 years ago when there was an MOU that came out, when at the G20 there was an announcement that was made? Because two dominant models of the last decade have just failed visibly in an 18-month sort of window. So we start with the shipping side. Houthi attacks began in October 23. Monthly Suez transits fell from 2,000 vessels to roughly 900 by late 2024. That's more than half of the traffic gone. So nearly 3/4 of maritime trade had to divert around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 14 extra days and close to $1 million in additional costs. But if we look at the other side of the ledger, which is the financing model, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative, had deployed over $1 trillion across 140 countries. Very impressive scale, but Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022, with Chinese lending accounting for close to 10% of its national debt. They are still reeling from it. Zambia and Ghana went through similar restructuring pain, and the IMF has since had to cap the lending into some of these arrangements. So we now have two proven failures, not one, which is dependence on a single shipping artery and a single state financier. This is the opening and this is the gap that IMEC is trying to fill and walk through. So now our paper comes to a sort of comparison on how these initiatives are actually built, because the true leader of this, the true star of this, is the governance model, not just the geographies of it. So the BRI is a vertically integrated system. Chinese state banks, particularly the China Development Bank, issue large, rapid, and conditioned loans. So these state-owned enterprises like Costco handle the constructions under tight contracts, and they typically retain long-term operational control after the asset is built as well. So basically the finance, engineering, and operations are all under one hand, all under one controlling design. The IMEC inverts the structure entirely. So the governments handle the regulation, development finance institutions like the EU's global gateway mobilize the capital. Private operators execute. For example, the Adani Group's India's Adani Group stake in Haifa, DP World's operation in
Have we lost Tejaswini? Aniruddha, would you like to take over? Priyam? Any of the three of you here? Dealing with technical issues. Tejasvi? Tejaswini, are you there? Or Aniruddha? I think we've lost them. Maybe we'll come back to them later. We will now probably move on to the next presentation. Hopefully they can rejoin us before the session ends. We will now go on to Ms. Beatrice Chater. She is an international trade lawyer from Ghana, and we welcome her to share her insights on her co-authored work with... Oh, Tejasvi is here.
Hi, sorry. Seems we had an internet issue.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Beatrice, please be on hold.
Yeah, sorry. And I believe my colleague Aniruddha has also been logged out. Hopefully he joins back.
Yes, he's back as well. Please go ahead.
Okay,
you have
great,
3-4 minutes now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we are looking at three sort of scenarios, and I'll just run through them with Aniruddha quickly. We have three variables that determine which future we are getting, which involves political coordination, financing discipline, and regional security. I'll let Aniruddha take over from here to run through the scenarios quickly and also look at what the policy recommendations are.
You can take 2 more minutes or 3 more minutes, please.
Over to Aniruddha, please.
Hello. Sorry, hi. So where does that bring us in terms of the scenario building? So we see three major scenarios so far. The first would be convergent resilience. It's the scenario where we expect everything to go right. That would mean phased operationalization by 2030. The eastern segments from Mundra sync very cleanly with the Mediterranean rail extensions. And critically, Oman gets brought in as a supplementary gateway with the ports of Duqm and Salah, letting the corridor bypass the Hormuz Strait entirely. That's not a minor detail because it's the biggest structural risk reducer in the entire architecture. Green fuel investments in this scenario would align with the EU's import targets and India's own production capacity, thereby cementing New Delhi's position as the primary logistical connector across the Indo-Pacific. Now, scenario number 2 in here would be the fragmented competition case, which is a cautionary case here. If we see renewed maritime hostilities around the Hormuz, milestones would be pushed past 2032. The corridor risk becoming largely symbolic. Lots of political rhetoric, but no coordinated financing behind it as such. So operations would stay capped at isolated eastern segments and early stage energy pilots. But here's the part that matters most. This wouldn't be a neutral outcome. While IMEC stalls, Beijing would not exactly stand still. It consolidates its own Indian Ocean port upgrades into exactly the gap that IMEC leaves open. Which brings me to my third scenario, which would be the picture of coercive disruption. Now, this third picture would be the stress test, and it's actually the most important one for this presentation. Imagine an even more serious escalation in the Gulf that forces 30% of global trade to reroute overnight. Insurance premiums spike by 200%. Rail networks stall at around 30% completion. The Neom to Akaba segments in particular freeze due to jurisdictional paralysis. Now here's what happens next. And it's the whole argument in a miniature. The coalition pivots. Oman's ports again provide the redundancy that bypasses Hormuz entirely. Piraeus port increase accelerates its upgrades. Adani and DP World would keep hydrogen pilots running at 1 million tons a year, even as the broader network is delayed. So the corridor does not exactly collapse in that sense overnight. It survives through modular activation. partial functionality across segments rather than total failure. And that's the thesis we want to leave this room with. Even in the worst case scenario, the plurilateral design still holds. Modular resilience outperforms the linear vulnerability of a centralized infrastructure. Now, this isn't a defense of IMEC in spite of disruption. It's a demonstration that this architecture was specifically built for a decade defined by disruption. So what does this mean in terms of policy recommendations? So if that's the design logic, what needs to happen to actually get IMEC to the convergent resilience outcome rather than drifting into fragmented competition? There are four main recommendations we have in mind. First would be to establish a permanent corridor authority by the fourth quarter of 2026, ideally speaking. Right now, IMEC has no standing secretariat. India, the UAE, the EU should chair a body that manages the genuinely unglamorous but essential coordination work such as railway standardization, hydrogen specifications, digital security protocols. Secondly, we'd want to bring in Oman here, a memorandum of understanding by early 2027 covering Duqm and Salah ports would let the corridor bypass the Strait of Hormuz entirely, and that enables Eastern Corridor pilots by 2028. Now, I've mentioned Oman quite a few times in this talk, and that's deliberate because, as I mentioned previously, it's the redundancy solution in both the best case and disruption scenarios. It's it's one of the largest
Please wrap it up.
Yeah. It's one of the largest leverage you have in addition in this architecture. Third would be a $50 billion risk pool by 2027, which is seeded by Gulf sovereign wealth funds, Western development banks using instruments like green bonds and political risk insurance. So this is a deliberate alternative to Beijing's state debt model. It's what lets IMEC avoid replicating the same vulnerability that caused maybe like Sri Lanka's default. And last, of course, would be we sequence 5 high return nodes rather than trying to build everything simultaneously. So we activate the Mundra Fujairah Green Corridor by 2027. We synchronize Saudi investment and target a 40% reduction in transit times by 2029 to prove commercial viability early. Now to close where we started, IMEC does not need to outscale BRI, it needs to out-survive it. A corridor that's distributed, modular, and privately capitalized isn't trying to win by being bigger, it's being built over the past decade, and it's going to be defined by disruption rather than steady state trade. And if the last 2 years have taught us anything about the Red Sea, about sovereign debt, about choke points, is that resilience is now more valuable as a currency than scale. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyam, Tejaswini, and Aniruddha, for that vivid assessment of how multimodal corridors, IMEC, BRI, are acting as competing geoeconomic models, especially in the light of recent Hormuz or Suez or Red Sea disruptions. Our next speaker takes us to the continent that is rapidly transforming into primary chessboard for tech and resource competition, Africa. We have with us Ms. Beatrice Chater, international trade lawyer from Ghana, to share insights on her co-authored work with Victor Kirima on digital highways and power games, how Africa's tech surge and geopolitical chess might shape its global economic future. Beatrice, welcome and over to you. Beatrice, are you there? Beatrice?
Yes, hello. I wasn't allowed to unmute until just shortly. Bear with me. Thank you. Yeah. And
we
also,
can't see you.
Yes, if I could also be allowed. Hold on a second.
Can her video be enabled?
I think the video is not yet enabled. Let me see. Okay, yes, enabled now. And just trying to share screen very quickly. Mm. Oh, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Go ahead,
All
please.
right. So let me just quickly go through. I don't need this slide, but basically I'm going to be talking about the paper that I co-wrote with my colleague Victor Kirima on how Africa's tech surge and geopolitical chess might shape its global economic future. Basically trying to discuss how Africa is navigating the delicate balance between rising resource nationalism, mounting debt pressures, and the emergence of digital capabilities, all while intensifying great power competition reshapes the continent's development trajectory. So Africa faces this triple dilemma. First, resource nationalism is resurgent as countries seek to benefit from their natural wealth. Second, debt pressures are mounting, with about 23 countries in debt distress. Third, great power competition is intensifying. You've got China, the US, and the EU, and the UAE are all vying for influence. So the question is whether Africa can navigate these forces to achieve genuine sovereign economic power. Africa holds about 30% of global mineral reserves and 12% of oil reserve. Yes, this hasn't actually translated into prosperity. The new scramble is now on. China is Africa's largest trading partner at $282 billion. The US and EU are countering through projects like the Lobito Corridor. The UAE has become the fourth largest investor. Infrastructure, critical minerals, and digital supremacy are the new battleground. So resource nationalism is back, driven by green transition demand, geopolitical rivalries, and post-COVID supply chain lessons. Zimbabwe, for instance, banned raw lithium exports in 2022, requiring foreign investors to build local processing. South Africa's renewable energy program requires local content and skills development. This represents a shift from mere extraction to value addition, a kind of crucial step for African economic transformation. 23 African countries are in debt distress, as I mentioned. 43% of external debt is held by private creditors. China holds $62 billion in bilateral debt. Countries spend more on debt servicing than on health, about 4.8% of GDP versus 2.6%. The sovereignty risks are real: loss of strategic assets, debt for infrastructure swaps, and geopolitical leverage. Africa's challenge, therefore, is to borrow without ceding control over its future. Africa's digital infrastructure is now a critical battleground. Only 40% of Africans are connected to the internet, compared to 73% globally. Africa accounts for just 1% of global data center capacity. Achieving universal access requires about $100 billion, 250,000 new 4G base stations, and 250,000 kilometers of fiber. The major players are Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Huawei, all competing to shape Africa's digital future. Digital public infrastructure, the digital commons of modern society, is central to sovereignty. But who controls it? Big tech companies now own critical undersea cables and data centers. Senegal's Jamdiado National Data Center exemplifies the push for sovereignty with mandatory repatriation of all administrative data. So this is about control over data, which has become the new oil. But despite challenges, Africa is demonstrating real innovation. FinTech leads the way. M-Pesa pioneered mobile banking. Flutterwave and Paystack are payment leaders. E-commerce, health tech, agri-tech, and GovTech are all growing. The big four innovation hubs attract over 80% of startup funding, which grew from 400 million in 2015 to 6 billion in 2022. So the digital economy is now projected to reach about 180 billion by 2030. Rwanda offers a blueprint for digital governance. Through Vision 2050 and the Smart Rwanda Master Plan, digital transformation is central. Achievements include near universal digital ID, the Irembo e-government platform, and the world's first national drone delivery service. Kigali Innovation City is a 2 billion flagship. The Startup Act 2023 provides tax breaks and simplified visas. Rwanda demonstrates what's possible with intentional policy intervention. The path isn't without obstacles. In our paper, we discuss the digital divide, which remains vast. Urban-rural gaps and gender inequality persist. Financing requires over 100 billion, as I've mentioned, bringing debt vulnerabilities. Regulatory fragmentation across 54 countries complicates trade. Cybersecurity is a growing threat. Africa is now at the heart of global cyber operations, according to the 2025 State of Cybersecurity Report. Misinformation and potential job displacement from automation are additional concerns. But the AU's digital transformation strategy 2020 to 2030, aims to break down digital silos, build local data processing capacity, ensure universal access, and cultivate homegrown talent. The AFCFTA's Protocol on Digital Trade, which was signed in February 2024, entrenches digital trade at the core of the continental agenda. So the goal is clear. Africa should become a producer and exporter of digital solutions, not just a consumer and data source. So to conclude, we make 4 key recommendations. First, implement the AFCFTA fully. Second, address debt using innovative financing tools. Third, secure digital sovereignty through robust laws. Fourth, use Africa's unified voice in global platforms like the G20. A unified Africa using all available policy instruments can channel geopolitical interests into sustainable sovereign economic power. Thank you for your attention. Happy to take questions whenever.
Thank you, Beatrice. It was a very concise and effective presentation. And thank you for emphasizing how regional tools like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and Unified Data Governance can empower Africa to maximize its leverage over critical minerals rather than that being caught in a scramble for resources. We now pivot to the core engine of global economic friction, the tech war between Washington and Beijing. I invite Mr. Purushendra Singh, visiting fellow at CUTS, to break down this high-stakes US-China technology race and the new geoeconomics of power, co-authored with Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, former Secretary East, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and distinguished fellow CUTS International. Purushendra, over to you.
Thank you, Divya. I hope I'm clear. Right.
You're audible, yes.
The very beginning of at the outset, I would like to say thank you, CUTS, for having all of us here. And also Ambassador Hein had laid out US-China tech rivalry. My chapter, along with co-authored with Ambassador Wadhwa, who has also been Indian ambassador to Poland, Italy, and Oman. So in our article, we look at how the geoeconomic rivalry between the two is shaping. And what we begin with is not looking at the past centuries, how trade was and tariffs were looked at as medium of competition. Now we have moved beyond military alliances and trade, and today what we are looking at, it is more contested over technology sharing, or over technology leadership, industrial resolution, supply chain connectivity, and also new rules about who governs the future global economy. In our chapter, we slowly transition between how the previous centuries were focusing on trade wars, tariff wars, and now it moves to a technology race. Now, given that we are looking from a third country, we cite a report from Australia Strategic Policy Institute that looks at technology tech report. which shortlists about 74 technologies, out of which 66 is where China is leading. And there are roughly 8 technologies where US is primarily leading this. Now, going ahead, what we are also looking at, and that's the core and a very simple argument that we make in our presentation and also in the article, is that the world is not going to be defined who owns the new age technologies or the niche technologies, but also who looks after the larger ecosystem to drive these technologies in the coming future. So that is where that's the central argument that we have. And going ahead, we have looked at few breaking through technologies. So these are semiconductor chips. This is the part of the larger ecosystem. Whoever controls will look at a kind of like having a better edge. Compute power, manufacturing capacity, supply chains, critical minerals, digital infrastructure, technical standards, data, finance, and investment. In other words, simply leadership, technology, leading in a way, along with the larger ecosystem, would lead the way forward. With this, we have also looked out at 3 broader technologies. One is semiconductors, the other one is AI, and the third is quantum and biotechnology moving ahead. Broadly, after a few findings of from different research, what we have found out is that US is primarily leading in technologies related to quantum computing, medical and research, and likewise. So when we talk about broadly semiconductors, in semiconductor, what we have found out that how US functions, US is leading and is good with research and development, is good with the designing. However, China leads in terms of fabrication of the chips. However, with the US now redrawing the larger strategic plan with the MSP, which has been laid out, specifically keeping China and Russia out of the mineral strategic partnership with EU, India, some countries of Africa, of course, the US, Japan, and South Korea are part of the larger partnership. Second is what we are looking at, the technology of artificial intelligence. Here, again, how AI is no longer about algorithms. It's moving beyond cloud computing, cloud infrastructure, and likewise. Now, with regard to semiconductor, what we have broadly found out that critical minerals come into a large diaphragm, and how China, especially in the early 2000s, coming out with Belt and Road Initiative, which was also discussed earlier today, had Xi Jinping had envisioned a new supply chain, which US is only catching up to now. And thirdly, what the another technology that we have looked out is on the broader terms of critical and rare earth minerals, where the two countries are now looking at some export related regulations. So US had come out with CHIPS Act. Similarly, China came out with export controls with regard to export control laws in 2020 with regard to holding down of especially germanium and gallium to stick down to these two. Now, both countries are increasingly relying on geoeconomic instruments rather than traditional military tools. The US has adopted export controls, the CHIPS and Science Act, investment screening, friendshoring, and trusted supply chains, also China +1 strategy. China, on the other hand, has been responding through state-led industrial policy, indigenous innovation, technological localization, national champions such as Huawei and SMIC, strategic use of critical minerals, how we have seen that they have relied heavily on export control with regard to critical minerals. Economic instruments have therefore become instruments of strategic competition. Now, moving ahead, in our chapter, we have come out with 4 future scenarios how this rivalry is going to play out. First is the managed competition, where we see both countries, despite their technological, political thrift, they maintain their economic balance and interdependence between both the countries. Second is technological bifurcation, where we see that in terms of some technological bifurcation, both the countries, they have their own medium of apps, they have their own medium of applications working side by side or being operated side by side without actual confrontation. The third that we see is selective cooperation, in which we see that both these countries, US and China, coming together on working on for larger global causes such as pandemic, for finding vaccines, for global warming related technologies, and likewise. And lastly, and the fourth, which is a little distressful, but if that happens, that will be escalating economic nationalism, where both these countries go in their separate different direction. And this scenario would involve expanding export controls, tariffs, sanctions, subsidy races, while intended to enhance security. Such measure could fragment markets, increase production cost, and slow global growth. Lastly, and how we conclude, is also we are not looking at this technological rift between both the countries as just bilateral. This will be, the globe would be affected by this. And we propose that balanced national security with economic openness is a way forward, building resilient and diversified supply chains rather than pursuing complete decoupling or strategy, or unlike strategy like China plus one. Investing in domestic research, innovation, and advanced manufacturing, strengthening international cooperation on AI governance, cybersecurity, digital standards, and critical minerals. Lastly, preserving dialogues such as this one, and also confidence building measures to reduce strategic risk is a way forward. With this, I'm happy to take on any questions going further with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Purshendra, for that precise breakdown. You've kept time very well. You've clearly illustrated how industrial policy and export controls have turned cutting-edge tech into the ultimate national security priority. For the final presentation, we finally turn to Eurasia to understand how sanctions and changing alliances are reshaping Russian strategies. I welcome Mr. Leonid Savin, Senior Editor at Geopolitical Russia, to present his work on Russian geostrategy and economy, disbalanced vectors and quest for own polarity. Leonid, the floor is yours.
Thank you for invitation and greetings to all from Moscow. So it's not a secret that we are in current situation of geopolitical turbulence. On the one hand, for many, it's political instability. For others, this is a good time in geoeconomics, especially for those actors who stay outside of main conflicts. And political scientist also talks about the growth of the middle powers, which use the existing opportunities to improve their position. At the same time, there is an opinion that as the world system changes from unipolarity to multipolarity, we are in a technopolar moment. Even technological countries or groups of states such as the European Union and the United States are quite concerned about sovereignty in the field of critical technologies, especially microelectronics and high-tech manufacturing. And the reason for this was the same, the deindustrialization of the past decades and an attempt to use globalization to exploit other countries where factories productions was moved. But with the current global defragmentation, technological leadership is becoming the key, not only to economic preferences, but also to geopolitical stability. Global instability also makes us think about reliable partners. Whether fragile states, if the political or economical situation worsens for them, will be able to follow to their obligations. The connected element between all the players is the infrastructure. Recently, a special term has even appeared, infrapolitics, which reflects how political decisions affect the situation with infrastructure systems. All states are elements of the complex chain of interdependence of world economy. Other risks can be added to this. Thus, sanctions can have a long-term effect on third countries since, as a rule, they impose it against such sectors of the economy that directly affect economic competition and the country's defense capability. Some believe that even climate change can also pose threats to access to necessary products and technological innovations. The European Union, for example, has come to the following conclusions regarding the geopolitics of the supply chain. First, the significant risk associated with trade diversifications due to the fragility of the state, economic coercion, and climate vulnerability. Second, diversification strategy is likely to be applied to raw material or components rather than high-tech areas such as data processor, telecommunications, or supercomputers, which require large investment to sustain themselves. And third, the existence European Union trade partnerships are a good basis for diversifications. At the same time, the European Union tried to introduce special tariffs and restrictive measures, hoping to gain a competitive advantage in this way. And Donald Trump's new tariff policy show that this only introduces serious uncertainty into transatlantic relations and beyond, effectively recreating a regime of great power more characteristic even of the 19th centuries than of the 20th, with its two world wars and the bipolar system of the second half of the century. The question is whether the leading players will use the same score for the concert. So it's discussion about next rule of global policy and economics, or will they have their own part. And I think that it seems that second option is more useful. And in context of geostrategy, we should pay more attention on Eurasia. Geopolitically, it's always worth price for external actors like Britain or United States. There is kind of idea fix of the control over Eurasia, reflected in books of Halford Mackinder, Nicholas Pikeman, or Zbigniew Brzezinski. For these reasons, pressure continues on Russia, heartland of Eurasia. For the same reasons, Western countries are actively trying to penetrate into Central Asia, the hinterland, which is an organic link between North and South, as well as between West and East of Eurasia. As a post-Soviet space, these countries already have a certain infrastructure, but as independent states, they have their own interests, which often contradict the interests of their neighbors. Firstly, there are constant disputes about the control of water resources, which are scarce for the region, so they show hydrohegemony is automatically raised. Energy is another important factor. In addition to the existing electric power grids, the possibility of building new nuclear power plants is being considered. The Russian company Rosatom already has contracts with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where it's planned to build power units. Negotiations are underway with Kyrgyzstan on the construction of low-power nuclear power plants. Increasing energy independence through such projects will help significantly enhance the capabilities of these countries and reduce tensions related to energy hunger. We must consider all this in the context of current global challenges, also related to climate change and the use of new technologies, such as data centers, as well as ongoing extraction of minerals from oil and gas to rare earth metals. At the same time, it's impossible not to pay attention to the myths of the so-called green economy or green revolutions, the active elements of which may have undesirable effects in the future. For example, we can take solar panels and wind turbines. In addition to the fact that their creation requires components that are associated with harmful production, there is no truly ecological technology for the disposal of used panels or plates of wind turbines. Therefore, they cannot be considered 100% environmentally friendly. In addition, it's necessary to take into account the issues of producer price ratios. China is currently leading in this area, and where there is a clear overproduction of these products as well as electric vehicles. And as part of the Belt and Road strategy, China is also conducting trade interventions in the sale of alternative energy production systems. Thus, we see a special type of competition where China has a clear advantage, since this segment remains in demand from external consumers. If we continue to talk about competition in the region, Turkey is another active player, but it tries to act through cultural and political strategies, through the organization of Turkic states, constructing an artificial ideology of common identity. Along with the cultural and political strategy, a business track is also being developed, including the sale of goods and the interest of construction companies. These companies are theoretically interested in developing the infrastructure of Central Asian countries, as this means obtaining construction contracts. However, two more powerful players remain, Iran and Afghanistan. Both countries have shown remarkable resilience in resisting external pressure, including the use of military force. Both countries need long-term reconstruction and development, including through projects of international importance, such as North-South Corridor in Iran and Turkmenistan-Afghanistan, Pakistan-India pipeline, and many other initiatives. So we have now listed a set of facts. However, specific solutions are needed to implement large-scale strategies. It really depends on political leaders of the countries of regions. For its parts, Russia is interested in strengthening the stability of this soft underbelly of Eurasia. So expanding any kind of partnership in terms of infrastructure projects will be in Moscow interest. And of course, my scientific interest more focused on theory of international relations, geopolitics, conflicts, and for example, I would like to present this book, Ordo Pluriversalis. It's also published in UK, in Italy, in Spain, in Brazil, and English version, I think it's available on Amazon. So with other Russian theorists like Professor Alexander Dugin, we tried to develop new theory of international relations on multipolarity and provide expertise to decision makers to implement in a practical.
You have the last minute.
It's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard, for illuminating Russia's shift, its strategy towards the Arctic, the North-South transport corridor, and its broader pursuit of strategic autarky within a multipolar framework. It is really hard to get good subject matter views from Russia on the subject, and hence thank you for your presentation. With this, we've had some 5 exceptionally rich presentations, and the floor is now open for question and answers. Please do type your questions into the Q&A box, stating who it is directed to, and please keep them brief. Couple of questions have already rolled in. There is a question on middle power. I'm going to club 2 of them into the same one. So in the context of the China-US strategic rivalry, the question is on how can the middle powers such as India and Latin America cooperate to safeguard their strategic autonomy. In the same breath, they also ask about the trade strategy for the middle powers. How can India leverage its initiatives such as IMEC to strengthen strategic autonomy and reshape regional architecture? I'm going to throw this question to Ambassador Jorge, Purushendra, and Aniruddha and Tejaswini. May I start with Ambassador Jorge first?
Sure. Yes. Thank you for that question. It seems to me that what we are seeing is a situation in which basically the dynamics of the international political situation are leading to the realization that the sort of policy that has been followed by Europe, to some extent India, which is trying basically to sort of soft balance, to try to keep as close a relation with the United States as possible, even in the very difficult circumstances of the second Trump administration, has backfired. We are seeing this in the case of Europe. You may recall the infamous visit by the president of the European Commission, Ms. Ursula von der Leyen, to the private golf course of Mr. Trump in Scotland to agree to a very unilateral type of trade agreement between Europe and the United States, in which European goods would be charged with a 15% tariff in the United States, and US goods going into Europe would be charged a zero tariff. This negotiated in private golf course of the US president. It was in many ways, a significant diplomatic surrender on the part of Europe. The argument was made at the time that this was done to assuage US concerns about Europe, and that the larger picture that Europe had in mind was of a strategic kind. That is, they were prepared to make concessions in the trade field for US continued support for European stance on the war in Ukraine. Well, that didn't happen. So it was an extraordinary diplomatic debacle. I would also argue that India's efforts to, keep as close as possible to the United States, as we have seen in the course of the past, year and a half, have also backfired. So those two things, it seemed to me, illustrate the fact that the way forward is really keeping your own position. This is related to my argument of active non-alignment. You keep your own interest, national interest, front and center. You do not choose sides. You do not side either with Washington or with Beijing, and you move forward. And it seems to me that the speech that Prime Minister Carney of Canada gave in Davos is an excellent example of that. If there is a country that is dependent on the United States, it is Canada. Yet the Prime Minister of Canada says we have to choose our own path. We can no longer depend on the United States. And that, it seems to me, is the big takeaway for middle powers in today's world. You have to stick to your own interests and move forward accordingly, rather than playing a footsie, either with Washington or with Beijing.
Pushendra, would you like to add on?
Yeah, just to add to Ambassador Hines, I agree to most of your points. For a country like India, maybe playing a long game, especially with regard to, if you see the current scenario, whether it's Trump 2.0 or whether it's working on a boundary with China, maybe playing a long game with regard to keeping our national interest intact, and also looking at the technologies that we get from. I agree that Trump 2.0 has been a little hazardous with regard to friendship with India, but at the same time, what we have gained, a lot of things have been moving on at the back burner, but they have been moving on since Trump 2.0. One of the area is military technologies related to military tech. So I don't agree fully that not aligning with US in the current scenario, but looking at the larger and the longer picture would suffice countries. We have been part of also strategic balancing is one way forward. We have been part of RIC, Russia, India, China. Russia has been a long time friend. We have been part of G7 at the same time. We have been part of G20. We are now looking at BRICS summit being held this year in India. So kind of like a balancing act, picking and choosing from what we want from different baskets of the world, what they have to offer, especially with regard to technology. That is an area I believe a country like India should maneuver and should move ahead. So I'll just keep to this. Thank you.
Niruddha, can I invite you to give your comments on how...
I'll just give 2 points here, bringing in the IMEC perspective. So the first is that we should look at IMEC as a portfolio, not a bet per se, because given that a lot of the setback is around the West Asian conflict, we want to see IMEC as part of a wider web that includes, deeper logistical arrangements. Let's say if the situation with Iran sort of cools down, then you have 2 corridors that are, working for India, namely the IMEC, which is there, and the INSTC, which has already been operational. So within the framework of the current geopolitical situation, it's autonomy or strategic autonomy would come from redundancy, not from picking the right corridor and committing to it. It's about having multiple leverage points. And the second in this sense here would be to use bilateral agreements as the load-bearing structure and multilateral MOUs as kind of a political umbrella that brings the various actors together. So you would have, multilateral framing, let's say the G20 or G7, where you can pursue diplomatic cover and gauge investment interest, but then you actually do the work of building sequences of like customs harmonization or like financing through bilateral deals to get the grunt work going. Like right now, given that the volume of trade between India and the UAE reaching like close to like 100 billion. So that already puts a lot of the value in place. And now India is in talks of having an FTA with the Gulf states, a comprehensive FTA. So that also sort of changes the equation with how trade corridor politics work. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your responses. We have another question here that's come in from Garima Sharma. Her question is on China's dominance over critical minerals and what are the economic, political, and strategic implications of its mineral diplomacy. Can I bring in Purushendra to answer on this and also later on draw Beatrice into the conversation to given the African perspective on this? Purushendra?
Great. Drawing briefly from Ambassador Hines' remarks that the third globalization started in 1980. It was in 1978 that China had slowly looked at the leap way forward as coming out. There, and in comparison with other countries, what China has been doing very novel and very nice at the very beginning. This was back in 1980s when they started actually digging out the surface for critical and rare earth minerals. Some of the countries, especially where I'm sitting right now in India, we have recently come out with our minerals policy. But however, China has been foresighted, I would say, to a large extent with regard to critical and rare earths mineral digging. And hence, there has been a state-led initiative. There has been the industrial policy since the very beginning. The recent one has come out in 2023, where they have been looking at how the state can support them furthermore. Now, the second one, especially Trump 2.0, they have come out with export controls, and they have been balanced with regard to how to what extent they should dig and to what extent they can export, and export to whom. So for long, I'll also request Beatrice to just join me here. But for long, they have been looking at Africa, and with regard to, again, Belt and Road Initiative, that is the kind of like corridor that they have looked at with regard to not just domestic manufacturing, but also the larger trade route. Thank you.
Beatrice, would you like to give in your perspective?
Yes. I think the footprint of China has been, quite long-standing in Africa, actually. China started with small projects. They actually have been participating in not just the infrastructure space, But apart from the government-to-government interaction, they've been doing a lot with science and technology, agriculture, and even things like academia, rolling out quite a lot of their Confucius institutes across Africa. So China's participation in Africa has been, quite entrenched. But we now see how they steadily started, not just with hard infrastructure, but also telecoms. So they helped to roll out 3G, 4G networks. I think Huawei is responsible for about 50% of 3G and about 70% of 4G networks in Africa. And now they are actually moving they're building into the Belt and Road, the digital Silk Road. So they're actually entrenching digital connectivity as a core pillar of the BRI. So we see this happening, but I think that apart from these strategic investments, China is still going to be very, very vested in trying to get these critical minerals, and it will do it either alone or in partnership. The interesting thing about China is that even where they face certain like bottlenecks or whatever, they just work around it and try to collaborate. Even with others. So we even see it to some extent, even in the Lobito, where they are still very much interested in partnering with whichever companies the countries have decided to work with. So very much playing the long game and just knowing their partnerships, knowing their collaborators. They have been in Africa a long time, and they're intending to stay, clearly.
Thank you, Beatrice. If I could bring in Leonard now, just want to understand in the context where Russia is turning towards strategic autarky, what is the real cost of this strategic autonomy? What is the single biggest domestic or economic sacrifice Russia must make to sustain the strategic autonomy over the decade? What would be your comments?
Actually, many outsiders think that there is serious problems in Russian economy for now, because Russia involved in special military operation in Ukraine. Actually, it's a real war, because the West supports Ukraine. NATO countries supports Ukraine, European Union supports Ukraine, and other partners of Western powers supports Ukraine. But economy in Russia, it's in not in a situation of war states. It's normal, it functions, and there is no serious problems. Sometimes, yes, we affected by attacks from Ukrainian side and some terroristic acts inside of Russia, but still it functions like years before. And I think we have more opportunities found in East and in South, because we are not cooperate more with European partners, ex-partners, so we more cooperate with China, with India, with Asian countries, more open for African countries, and also many African countries enjoys about this type of cooperation with Russia. We also open a new page of our relations with some countries of Latin America. Of course, there is, like Mr. Ambassador told, there is kind of don't-rob policy, and Mr. Trump thinks that it is a backyard of United States now, but still we have normal contacts with many Latin American countries. And I think after our victory over neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine, our economic will be more rise and more flourish, and also will be fruitful for and benefits for our partners abroad, including India, including many countries.
Ambassador Jorge, would you like to add your comments from the perspective from your presentation where you spoke about the active non-aligned? What is the economic cost of strategic autonomy in Latin America? Please unmute yourself, Ambassador.
It is important to keep in mind the following. The notion of active non-alignment draws on the traditions of the non-aligned movement, obviously, and adapts it to the realities of the new century. Strategic autonomy is, a somewhat different term. It has come to light in Europe in terms of its relations with the United States. It's also been used in India, of course. I myself think that active non-alignment is a better term to describe the options that face countries in the global South. It means having a position that is actively looking for opportunities. It tries to make the most of this situation, and what it does is to exploit the fact that you have two great powers competing for the favor of the hearts and minds of governments and peoples around the world. And in that sense, it points to a different situation that existed during the so-called unipolar moment of US dominance that extended itself in the post-Cold War period from 91 till 2016. And it seems to me those opportunities are very much out there, but they require a very sophisticated diplomacy that is able to make the most of the opportunities that come to light. And it seems to me that countries in Asia and in Africa and in Latin America can do that. I mentioned the case of Brazil, but this is not just something that larger countries like Brazil can do. Also, smaller countries like Ecuador and others can engage in it. Thank you. Mi amor, no puedo hablar.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would just like to close out this panel now with this one final lightning question for all the 5 panelists. If you had to name the single most critical geoeconomic shield your region must build right now, what would it be? Food security, semiconductor fabs, what would it be? Let us go with the reverse order of the presentation, starting with Leonid, Prushendra, Beatrice, Aniruddha, and then Ambassador Jorge. Yeah, Leonid. Leonid, are you there?
Sorry, there's some problem with the sound. Can you repeat, please?
Okay, so just to close out, if you have to say in one sentence or one word, what is that single most critical geoeconomic shield your region must build right now in this geo space that is happening or that is unfolding? What would it be? Would it be food security, semiconductor fabs, domestic mineral processing? What would it be for Russia? What would it be?
I think it depends on country. For example, in Russia, no any problem with food security and with energy security. We have some kind of autarky. We're not independent for any supplies from abroad for our existence. So it, I think, depends from position or from which country we look for. For African countries, yes, it's some problem with food security for next year. For some countries, it's problem of military and defense security. For other, it's cyber technology. So I think it should be balanced, and decision makers should to check what they need to our nations and our people.
Prushendra, just give it in one word.
Keeping up with the diversified supply chain with regard to critical minerals.
Beatrice, just one word. What would it be for Africa?
Yes, it would be the AFCFTA. We must implement fully right now and do value added under it. And that includes things like the critical minerals, adding value to that. And then also at the same time, making sure we implement all the AU protocols, the ones on free movement, the one on cybersecurity, the Malabo Convention, all of that. Yeah. I think actually the biggest shield is regulation done well and implemented well.
Aniruddha, what would be your take?
I think getting Oman into IMEC, diversifying the traditional route that was originally planned. So by bringing in Oman, you'd probably build in the redundancy that's required.
What would it be for Latin America, Ambassador?
I think digital diversification and enhancing our connectivity via submarine fiber optic internet cables is absolutely critical. We depend very heavily today on such connections with the United States, and we need to diversify away from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you for this. And with this, we have come to the end of this webinar. Thank you to all the distinguished presenters, to the audience for joining in and engaging. And thanks to Kutz as well. Thank you all and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.